In the far eastern edge of Death Valley, the land settles into a long depression between mountain ranges. The valley floor lies below sea level in places, a broad expanse of salt flats, gravel fans, and dry washes. To the west rise the Panamint Mountains. To the east stand the Black Mountains. For much of the year, the air is still. Winter light spreads evenly across the basin. The sky appears open and distant. Water is scarce but not entirely absent. Small springs emerge in narrow places where underground flow meets the surface. Around them, sparse growth persists, mesquite, salt grass, occasional reeds. Beyond these points, the ground returns to mineral crust and fractured clay. In summer, temperatures climb beyond what most landscapes endure. The heat gathers without obstruction. It reflects upward from pale ground and presses downward from cloudless sky. Shade is limited to rock faces and low brush. The wind, when it comes, carries warmth rather than relief. In 1849, this basin was unmarked on most emigrant maps. It held no formal roads. No towns. No wells recorded in guidebooks. It was a quiet space between mountain corridors, seldom crossed and rarely described. In the autumn of 1849, a group of emigrants traveling toward California left the established trail along the Humboldt River. They were part of a larger migration shaped by the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill the previous year. Thousands were moving westward. Wagons crowded familiar routes. Grazing land grew scarce. The promise of a shorter passage drew many to consider alternatives. The group that would later be known as the Bennett-Arcane Party included families, single men, women, and children. Most had begun their journey months earlier in the Midwest. They carried standard equipment for overland travel, wagons reinforced with iron fittings, oxen teams, flour, bacon, beans, tools, spare axles, and rifles. Some had previous frontier experience. Others did not. Few had direct knowledge of the desert basins south of the Great Salt Lake. Near Salt Lake City, several emigrants encountered a guide named Jefferson Hunt. Hunt proposed a cutoff route that would leave the main California Trail and pass south of the established road before turning west again toward the Sierra Nevada. The path promised to reduce travel distance. It was described as passable for wagons. Some members of the larger wagon train followed Hunt. Others, uncertain or impatient, formed separate clusters along the way. The Bennett and Arcane families joined one such contingent. As weeks passed, the terrain changed. Grasslands gave way to alkali flats. Reliable streams became intermittent. Navigation depended on memory, word of mouth, and rough sketches. Trails divided and rejoined without markers. Tension developed gradually rather than suddenly. Draft animals weakened as forage diminished. Water holes were found dry or brackish. The desert did not announce itself with a single boundary. It unfolded in stages, long stretches of pale ground, distant ridgelines, and silence. By late November, the party had separated from Hunt's main group. Reports differed about which canyon offered passage through the mountains ahead. Some accounts later suggested disagreement over direction. Others described simple miscalculation. What is certain is that a portion of the emigrants pressed forward into terrain that was less known than they believed. Their wagons rolled into a basin bordered by steep slopes and uneven ridges. From a distance, the valley appeared manageable. The floor seemed level. The mountains beyond suggested an eventual western exit. No map in their possession clearly described what lay ahead. They entered without understanding that the basin would close around them. As the wagons descended from the surrounding highlands, the emigrants expected to find a clear western outlet. Instead, the valley stretched farther than anticipated. The floor was firm in places but broken by salt crust and soft patches that slowed the teams. The mountains on the opposite side rose sharply, with few visible passes wide enough for wagons. The party moved south along the base of the range, searching for an exit. Days passed in measured progress. Each attempt to locate a practical crossing required scouts to ride ahead on horseback. They returned with limited information. Canyons narrowed into rock. Slopes steepened beyond what oxen could manage. Water became the immediate concern. Small springs were discovered near what is now known as Furnace Creek. The supply was modest but dependable. The emigrants halted there to consider their position. Some argued that they should retrace their route eastward. Others believed a western passage must exist and that retreat would cost more time and strength than pressing forward. The decision to remain temporarily near the springs marked a shift. The journey was no longer continuous movement toward California. It became a pause within isolation. Wagons were drawn into a rough circle. Oxen were unyoked and allowed to graze on sparse vegetation. Fires were built from broken wagon parts and collected brush. Exploration parties continued to search for an exit. Each returned with similar reports. The surrounding mountains did not yield easily. The valley was not a corridor but a basin. By early December, the emigrants understood that departure would require either abandoning their wagons or locating a distant pass on foot. The route behind them was now uncertain. Supplies were reduced. The moment of simple travel had ended. They were committed to a place few had entered before and none fully understood. The springs near what is now called Furnace Creek offered the only reliable water the party had found since entering the basin. The flow was limited but steady. It emerged warm from the ground and collected in shallow pools before seeping into the gravel. Around it grew thin stands of grass and low mesquite. The emigrants chose this site as their base. Wagons were positioned to form a loose enclosure. Canvas covers were left in place to provide shade. Where fabric had worn thin, additional layers were fastened with rope or strips of leather. The ground was hard and uneven. Some families cleared small areas of stone to lay bedding directly on the earth. Others constructed partial windbreaks from brush. The temperature during winter months was not yet at the extreme levels for which the valley would later be known, but the air was dry and the sun direct. Daytime warmth alternated with cold nights. Fuel was scarce. Broken wagon parts, spare boards, and brush were gathered and rationed carefully. The decision to burn sections of their own vehicles was not made lightly. Each piece reduced the possibility of continuing west with full equipment. Food supplies were assessed. Flour remained in diminishing quantities. Salt pork and bacon were divided into measured portions. Beans and dried goods were conserved. Hunting opportunities were limited. Small game was scarce in the open basin. A few animals were taken in the surrounding hills, but not in sufficient number to sustain the group for long. Daily life settled into routine. Water was collected at regular intervals and carried back in buckets and kettles. Oxen were driven to the edges of the greenest patches near the springs, though grazing was poor. Children remained close to camp. Adults rotated between maintenance tasks and scouting efforts. Conversations turned repeatedly to maps, recollections, and rumors heard months earlier along the trail. Exploration parties left at first light and returned by evening when possible. They examined nearby canyons, testing gradients and searching for signs of passable terrain. Several routes appeared promising from a distance but narrowed into steep rock or loose scree. The emigrants measured slopes by eye and by experience. Wagons required space not only for wheels but for turning and descent. As days passed, the reality of abandonment began to surface. Without a workable pass, the wagons themselves would become anchors. Some members proposed dismantling them entirely and packing only essential goods. Others hesitated, aware that surrendering the wagons meant relinquishing security and much of their remaining food. The springs sustained them, but they also defined the limits of survival. Beyond a short distance, the land offered no reliable water. Any extended scouting required careful planning and strict rationing. The valley's scale became clearer with each attempt to leave it. Distances were greater than they had seemed. Ridges concealed further ridges. By late December, the party had shifted from travelers to temporary residents of the basin. Shelter was basic but organized. Rations were controlled. Movement was deliberate. The question was no longer whether they were delayed. It was how they would depart at all. By the turn of the year, routine had become the structure that held the group together. The springs determined the rhythm of each day. Water was collected in the morning and again before dusk. Containers were inspected for leakage. No drop was discarded without purpose. Washing was reduced to necessity. Clothing stiffened with dust and mineral residue. Food was divided with increasing precision. Flour was measured by cup rather than by handful. Meat portions were cut thinner. Some accounts later recalled the slaughter of weakened oxen. The animals, once essential for hauling wagons, had become a diminishing resource. Their meat provided temporary relief but could not last long without preservation methods suited to the dry air. Strips were hung and dried where possible, though insects and contamination remained concerns. Foraging extended outward from the springs. Mesquite beans were gathered when found. Small roots were tested cautiously. Knowledge of desert plants among the emigrants was limited. Experiment carried risk. What could be eaten safely was determined through observation and restraint. Scouting parties continued to search for an exit. Men traveled light, carrying canteens and minimal provisions. They moved into the surrounding mountains, attempting to identify a western pass that wagons might cross or at least a route navigable on foot. Elevation offered perspective but not certainty. From high points, the valley revealed its breadth. An expanse that had seemed manageable at ground level now appeared enclosed by successive ridgelines. The possibility of leaving the wagons grew more immediate. Each exploration confirmed that hauling full vehicles over the nearest passes would require gradients and pathways not present. The emigrants debated the risks of splitting the party. A small group might travel faster on foot, seeking help in settlements rumored to lie west beyond the mountains. Yet departure would reduce the number of adults remaining to support women and children. The desert imposed discipline without visible force. Tasks were simple but essential. Fires were built sparingly. Tools were repaired when possible. Leather was patched. Wheel rims were examined even as the likelihood of using them diminished. Order provided steadiness in a place without landmarks. Time blurred without external reference. There were no passing travelers to mark the season. The sky remained clear more often than not. Tracks left in dust lingered until disturbed by wind. Sound carried across open ground but rarely brought new information. The group's endurance rested on management rather than movement. They conserved strength. They reduced expectation. Each decision was weighed against distance and supply. The valley did not change. It waited, neutral and expansive, while the emigrants adjusted their scale of living to match it. By January 1850, remaining at the springs no longer appeared sustainable. Supplies had thinned to a level that allowed little margin for delay. The nearest settlements in California lay somewhere beyond the Panamint Mountains, though exact distances were uncertain. After repeated discussion, a decision was made to divide effort. A small group of men would attempt to cross the mountains on foot in search of assistance. Among them were William Manley and John Haney Rogers. They carried limited provisions, small quantities of flour, dried meat, and canteens filled at the springs. Firearms were taken, though ammunition was finite. The journey would require ascending steep ridges, descending into unfamiliar valleys, and locating water sources that were not mapped. Those who remained at Furnace Creek prepared for continued waiting. The wagons, by then partly dismantled for fuel, were arranged to provide what shelter they could. The separation was practical rather than ceremonial. No formal record describes extended farewells. The task required departure before first light to preserve strength in cooler hours. Manley and Rogers moved westward into the Panamint Range. Snow covered higher elevations, contrasting with the dry basin they left behind. Progress was slow. Trails were not defined. They navigated by terrain and direction, adjusting course as canyons narrowed or cliffs intervened. Water became scarce soon after leaving the valley floor. The crossing required several days. At times, they retraced steps to avoid impassable slopes. Eventually, after traversing the mountains and descending into what is now the Owens Valley region, they encountered signs of habitation and secured limited assistance. Their objective shifted from escape to return. They would attempt to bring relief back across the same ground. At Furnace Creek, those who remained continued their reduced routine. Flour was nearly exhausted. Meat from slaughtered oxen had been consumed in small portions. Strength declined gradually, most visibly among children and older members of the party. Work slowed. Movements became deliberate and measured. Uncertainty weighed more heavily than hunger. No clear timeline existed for the return of the men who had crossed the mountains. Days passed without sign. The valley remained unchanged, broad, quiet, and indifferent. Tracks left by the departing party faded in dust and wind. Some attempted short excursions toward nearby rises, scanning for movement in the distance. Each effort required calculation of water carried and distance traveled. No one strayed far from the springs. The risk of becoming lost within the basin was understood. Illness, though not widely detailed in surviving accounts, likely accompanied malnutrition and exposure. Fires were smaller as fuel diminished. Night temperatures dropped sharply. The group endured through stillness rather than action. Time stretched. The question was no longer whether the valley could be crossed, but whether help would return before provisions ended entirely. After several days of travel, Manley and Rogers reached settlements in the eastern Sierra. They obtained supplies and returned to Furnace Creek, bringing flour, bacon, and guidance on the safest route out of the basin. Their arrival marked the transition from survival by endurance to organized departure. The emigrants prepared to leave slowly. Wagons that could still roll were readied. Remaining animals were harnessed. Those too weak to travel on foot were assisted with sleds or carried short distances. The group moved in stages, adjusting pace to the slowest members. Crossing the mountains required careful navigation. Trails chosen by Manley and Rogers allowed the party to avoid the steepest slopes and locate intermittent water sources. Progress remained difficult, but the presence of guidance and provisions reduced risk. Over time, the party descended into valleys leading west, eventually rejoining the California Trail at known waypoints. Exhaustion and depletion persisted, yet every step carried them closer to established settlements where safety and sustenance were available once more. The valley where the emigrants endured would later be named Death Valley, a reflection of the extremes encountered by those who passed through it. Its low floor, harsh sun, and scarcity of water tested endurance without ceremony. The story of the Bennett, Arcane Party remains a quiet record of survival, measured decisions, careful rationing, and persistent movement in the face of an indifferent landscape. The valley, vast and still, retains its expanse, leaving only the traces of those who once navigated its depths. The basin's silence endures, a testament to both human perseverance and the impartiality of the desert.